And of course, we're nearing 42,000. Earlier today, we were nearing 42,000 deaths. We might be actually over that toll now. I haven't checked in a couple hours, but it's hard to see the tolls keep climbing. But of course, Turkey and Syria deeply, deeply affected by this in similar situations, but in very different situations because of the sanctions that have been placed on Syria. And we're very honored as we continue the show to be joined by Professor Alena Douhan, who is a UN Special Rapporteur and a professor of international law. Professor, thank you so much for joining us.
It was a pleasure. Thank you for inviting.
No, very, very happy to have you. And I guess that's my first question is, how are sanctions impacting relief efforts in Syria? The U.S. government, of course, is telling people in the media here that they aren't impacting them at all. They have no impact on humanitarian relief. So I wonder from your perspective what the real story is.
Well, I need to say that I know the situation in Syria pretty well, taking into account that I did my country visit just 3 months ago. That's why I had the possibility to talk to many humanitarian actors on the ground and see the challenges they face in their humanitarian work, even before the earthquake happened. And even before the earthquake, they were referring to the very serious problems in delivery of humanitarian aid, even the types of humanitarian aids which were exactly fitting the formally existing humanitarian exceptions like food and medical equipment. Even for the majority of these deliveries, they were supposed to get a number of licenses, even, for example, a license to fuel the car inside of the Syria to deliver humanitarian aid from the border to the place of destination. Getting humanitarian licenses took a long time for them, and sometimes it lasted for several months, if not years, to get the license and deliver humanitarian aid. They were referring to the problems to get donations and to do fundraising because any IP addresses or Syrian IP addresses and phone numbers were blocked. So donors couldn't provide humanitarian assistance. And anything which went beyond medicine and food was absolutely prohibited to be delivered to the country in order not to be interpreted as helping reconstruction or rebuilding of the country and therefore claiming to support the government of Syria. And unfortunately, in this situation, when Syria faced extremely serious problems with access to water, to electricity, majority of cities had electricity only 1 or 2 hours per day. Access to clean water was extremely limited. That's why there were cholera outbreaks. There was an enormous shortage of fuel in the country, so people couldn't afford that. And there was a very serious shortage of the equipment because it couldn't be delivered due to sanctions regimes. And therefore, in the aftermath of the break, there was a problem to get to the problems, to the places affected by the earthquake, to help people to get out from under the stones and to deliver these people to the hospitals. Hospitals were facing very serious shortage of the medicine and medical equipment, so even, for example, catheters to use for blood transfusions, as well as serious equipment like X-rays or CT scanners for people injured or wounded by the earthquake. And besides the public banks and 2 private banks in Syria, which used to deal with international transaction, were designated in the sanctions list, were cut off SWIFT. Therefore, people, as well as the humanitarian organization, the country couldn't get donations from outside, even from their relatives and friends. And naturally, all this undermined the preparedness of Syria to deal with the consequences of the earthquake, and plus it prevented the activity of humanitarian organizations in this sphere. I naturally am aware of the general license of the United States 23, which was issued on February 8, and I welcome this license a lot because it's already opened some ways for delivery of humanitarian aid and financial transactions, although I believe that it's not enough, taking into account that for example, for the third actors like banks, it's very complicated to differentiate what is the relief operations entitled by the license and, for example, reconstruction and rebuilding transactions which are prohibited by other sanctions regimes. So I'm absolutely sure that many banks and many actors will decide to overcomply and not to risk. Moreover, the license doesn't contain a guarantee for humanitarian actors that they won't be punished for their humanitarian work. And moreover, the last point, other countries which impose sanctions on Syria didn't issue any humanitarian derogation, general humanitarian license to enable the free flow of humanitarian assistance to Syria.
I'm curious what needs to happen. Like, I mean, if the US is going to issue a general license for what, like 180 days, in a way, it's demonstrating that they are aware that their sanctions are, in fact, obstructing humanitarian aid. So, given that this earthquake has highlighted just how horrible the sanctions are, what needs to happen in the aftermath of this? If you were in charge, like, what would you do?
First of all, if I would be in charge, I would request everyone to observe standards of international law, because the majority of unilateral sanctions imposed today do not correspond to the standards of international law. And therefore, the effect on human rights is just the consequence of the illegal behavior. Well, as a first step, in the press release, which has recently been issued by 10 special rapporteurs, we are lift sanctions which prevent reconstruction and rebuilding of Syria. Plus, we request to make sure that the delivery of humanitarian aid is not impeded. Humanitarian organizations, which are already doing an enormously complicated and dangerous job on the ground, they shouldn't face the risk to be designated for violation of sanctions regimes and to be prevented of doing this work. And naturally, all these complicated legal terminology in the exemptions, exceptions, and derogations prevent many humanitarian steps to be taken. They prevent country for reconstruction. They prevent country from development. People can't live with water, without food, without money, without electricity. They need to be able to build up their lives and to live the decent life.
One of the things that you mentioned that I think is really important when we talk about sanctions is this issue of overcompliance. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about that, because I think a lot of people feel, well, if it's like quote unquote technically legal, that anyone would be willing to then go ahead and do some business transaction. But overcompliance is a huge issue in Syria and other nations that I know are hit with sanctions.
Indeed, today overcompliance turned to be a really huge issue, and it exacerbates the impact of the direct unilateral sanctions enormously. One of the problems is that the legal regulations imposing unilateral sanctions, because of the fact of their dual legality from the point of international law, they are very confusing and they are very complicated. The majority of terms are unexplained there, and therefore no one knows what exactly is prohibited. Point number two, there are usually a number of countries, not a single one, which imposes unilateral sanctions. And as a result, these sanctions are overlapped, but they are not equal. So basically, in order to be precise about what exactly is allowed and what exactly is prohibited, you need to get exactly about a single country against a specific sphere to be able to verify this element. At the very end, when it comes to the check-in, no private bank or no private individual is able to do all the verification. Moreover, many sanctioning regulations provide for the possibility to impose sanctions or to start criminal or civil case for circumvention of sanctions regime. And as far as no one is absolutely sure what exactly is prohibited by sanctions, many businesses and banks prefer to use so-called zero-risk policy. So they are not sure that something is prohibited, but they prefer not to risk. And at the very end, it ends up in situation when, for example, no one checks what exactly is prohibited as concerns Syria. They decide not to act as soon as they hear the word Syria. So the private businesses and banks and even individuals and universities decide not to have anything to do if it involves Syrian nationals, Syrian companies, or the country of destination is Syria. That's why, for example, I have referred to the problems to do fundraising for humanitarian organizations if they have Syrian phone number or Syrian IP address. They are immediately blocked. Many humanitarian organizations registered in Europe have complained that their fundraising programs have been blocked by fundraising platforms as soon as identified that humanitarian assistance will be directed to Syria or will be delivered to Syria. That's overcompliance.
I also want to ask about the issue of other countries, because something that's unique about the sanctions on Syria is that there's these secondary sanctions that the US has deemed it can apply to other countries who engage in economic activity with Syria. So it's this issue of like extraterritoriality. Can you address that issue and then how it has potentially impeded efforts for other countries to help Syria in the aftermath of this earthquake?
Indeed, the issue of secondary sanctions is one of the very important reasons why many countries, many businesses, and many banks end up in overcompliance. So, from the other side, their risks are not grounded because, in reality, the Caesar Act implemented by the United States in 2019 expressly provides for the possibility to designate third country nationals and companies if they are engaged in reconstruction or rebuilding of Syria. To be able to understand what reconstruction and rebuilding is, means that even if one tries to deliver spare parts to maintain water pump or to maintain electricity station, it's already a reconstruction or rebuilding. If one tries to get training for school teachers how to teach math to the first grade at school, if we speak about the public schools, it's construction building. So the of the public sector or understanding of support of the government is enormously broad. Even if someone wants to do I would say a lesson for street children in the building, public building provided by the government, they need extra license to do it. And sometimes they can't get this license because the building is public, and that means that they enable the capacity of the government to take care of anything what's happening on the territory. Therefore, I would refer to the of extraterritoriality. From the point of international law, extraterritoriality is absolutely illegal, and it's confirmed even by several countries which impose sanctions on its own. For example, the European Union, sanctions of which are also dubious from the point of international law, and I would say in the majority of cases they're illegal. The European Union explicitly said that extraterritoriality is against international law. And many humanitarian exceptions provided by the European Union directly refer to the fact that the businesses of the European Union are not supposed to implement and comply with sanctions of the United States. At the same time, businesses are not prohibited, are not protected against possible punishment. That's why they comply anyway.
Wow.
Yeah, wow, that's just amazing on so many different levels, and you know, I mean, I think it's notable here that we have seen. I think the point that you made at the beginning, that even prior to the earthquake, there were so many different challenges to the humanitarian situation, and I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about that, because of course the two things are related. I mean, if there are so many difficulties in rebuilding from a war, if you then have an earthquake, you know, it's compounding crises. So it's not just one crisis than another, but they sort of are building on one another.
Indeed, the humanitarian situation in Syria before the earthquake was already catastrophic. Take into account, naturally, it was not because of sanctions only, because the country infrastructure and the country itself has been severely affected by 12 years of military hostilities on the territory of Syria. Due to the same hostility, there were millions of migrants outside of Syria, and plus there were millions of internally displaced persons. And as you understand, take into account that these internally displaced persons may have separated families. There could be children without documents. There could be people without any documents, people which have lost all their relatives. And that means that all of them need basic care. All of them sometimes need documents. And when it comes to children, many of them tend to be street children. That means that they do not even know the difference between good and evil. And they do not know the basic standards of population. That means that all of them somehow shall be rehabilitated back to the society. As from the infrastructure in Syria was enormously affected by the military hostilities first, and secondly by the impact of unilateral sanctions, because as I have mentioned, any efforts to rebuild Syria infrastructure was prohibited by unilateral sanctions imposed over that. That basically means that all spheres like transportation, water supply, electricity, internet access, irrigation system, agricultural machinery, food production systems, and even medicine production system and pharmaceutical sphere, aviation system, we are severely affected. And in the situation when people are only able to have 1 hour per day electricity or 2 hours per day electricity, that means that the majority of the infrastructure they need is not functioning. Similar situation exists with supply of water. I'm not talking about the drinking water only. I'm talking about the water for sanitation, for example. I visited a school in the rural homes, and the school has just started to function. So for your understanding, that's a building which is affected by military hostilities. There were no windows no glass in the windows, and it can be very cold in winter. You could see pieces of armature, so pieces of iron rods, which just stick out of the windows. There is no possibility for heating, and anyway, heating won't help because you do not have any glass windows. And there was no possibility even to use the lavatory for students, because there was a place for lavatory, but there was no water in that lavatory. So there is no use for that. Similar situation exists in the hospitals. Due to the migration, there was a shortage of doctors. For example, it was reported that in many hospitals there was no doctors for intensive therapy, what is enormously important in the aftermath of the earthquake. There were no anesthesiologists in many hospitals. That's why surgeries were very risky for people. There was a problem with equipment. For example, in cancer hospital in rural Damascus, I was reported, and that's a main cancer hospital, I was reported that the line for CT scanner is 6 months. It basically means that a patient with first stage cancer will up with third or the fourth stage by the moment when he or she is able to do her CT body scanning. Unfortunately, similar situation exists in all areas. With no electricity, there is a problem to proceed with food production, with agriculture, no possibility to buy spare parts. Poverty level in Syria at the moment of my visit was around 90%. The same amount of people were considered to be food insecure.
Well, Professor, we really appreciate you joining us and helping break all of this down in a terrible situation. But again, thank you for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
It's a pleasure for me. Thank you for inviting.